I hold two wood blocks. Number one and number two. Number one and number two. One of these wood blocks was used on King Crimson's Lark Tongues In Aspic album. Do you know which one it was?
It would be a guess, but two.
Number two it is. Number two is
Cool.
a new era British percussion company woodblock. The story of how I came to have this incredible artifact coming right up. Hello, folks. I'm Gregg Bendian. Welcome to the ProgCast. I thought we'd try something a little bit different today, and been thinking about this for a while. I thought it'd be really fun to tell some stories of my musical career that have been of interest and have been really profound experiences for me as a growing musician. And I thought no better way to start that kind of series of talks than to tell you the story of my interaction and experience with one of the most fascinating and kind of mysterious, I guess, figure in progressive rock music, the percussionist Jamie Muir. And I was fortunate enough to have some pretty amazing experiences interacting with Mr. Muir, and I thought it'd be fun to talk about some of those today. And helping me out, my co-host and associate producer, Matt Stober's here today. Hi, Matt.
Hey,
Matt's a great guitar player and composer, and we have a record together, a project called Made of Water, and the album's Hydrosphere. It's on Bandcamp. So, a little bit of background on my early years as a musician and really awakening as a percussionist. I think starting out, I really just wanted to be a drummer. But when I started to become more mature and interested in progressive music around the age of 10 or 11, I was hearing a lot of percussion in progressive rock. So Carl Palmer was playing percussion on things. Weather Report had always had percussionists. Armin Halburian was on a lot of that Keith Jarrett stuff and ECM stuff. Illyrio Lima. Percussion was all over the place. Percussion was in Gentle Giants music. It was in the contemporary classical stuff that we were playing in percussion ensemble at school. Found objects, household objects, pots and pans and things. And so John Cage was writing for these kinds of found objects. We were aware of all that stuff, and as a burgeoning percussionist, like it was all on the table in the 70s. So we had prog rock guys who were incorporating percussion, but you also had percussion ensemble music was really big around that time. Exotica in terms of world music, a lot of different percussion was coming into to the the atmosphere, from a None Such Explorer and other places. And being a prog rock guy, I'd come up listening to In the Court of the Crimson King when it came out. I would have been about 7 when I heard it. And, that kind of stuff really went in. It really, really got me excited. It wasn't lost on me that Moonchild had a vibraphone solo and a free improv. I don't think it dawned on me that there was free improv at that point, but yeah, so by the time this rolls around, and that's Lark Tongues In Aspic by King Crimson, 1972. I was already into Crimson. I guess I don't think I heard Larks when it came out. But right around that time, I was already into Bruford from Yes. So I've been one of those drummers that followed Bruford from Yes into King Crimson.
Mm.
And we got turned on to a lot of different things listening to King Crimson. But when the new group had, that Lark's Tongue group had a percussionist, it was very interesting because in retrospect, you can see that Weather Report and the bands that had percussionists were many, and so having a drummer and a percussionist in a band was definitely a thing around 1972,
Mm.
although not obviously not limited to that. But we were fascinated by what the percussion sounds were, what were the instruments, what was his setup. We didn't have the video that you guys can watch now on YouTube of King Crimson playing Lark's Tongues Part 1 in the studio, multicam. No, we didn't have that. We had photos of Jamie's setup. We were lucky if we could figure out what was in there. Oh, it looks like there's a thunder sheet in there. Oh, it looks like he plays left-handed. So these kinds of things we were noticing. And then also I had the Young Person's Guide to King Crimson, which was a double album LP that had cuts from through everything up to that point, like everything up through Red, from the beginning to Red. And it was a great compilation. It was incredibly far-reaching, all the different bands, all the different areas. And it was interesting because at that point there was a booklet with Fripp's diaries talking about working with Jamie Muir and talking about how he was swinging chains and it almost hit Fripp in the head, and just a lot of really amazing stories of what that live band would have been like. And we had no other document than the album. So now that there's this box set that I was holding up and all of the bonus stuff, but there's still not a ton of stuff with Jamie and King Crimson. So, hearing him with Bruford, and I think the impact that Jamie had on Crimson was really interesting to me too, because I remember being, like I say, I was a Bruford fan, and he was in print talking about what a big influence and inspiration Jamie Muir was to him. And as a budding percussionist, when somebody says, "Oh, that guy's cool," or "You should check that guy out," at that point I thought, "Oh, I really got to listen more with headphones and check out what the percussion is doing on this." We couldn't really find bootlegs of that period until much later. But yeah, he had a big influence on Bruford. He also had an influence on John Anderson of Yes, who had seen Jamie perform with Crimson, and this is according to John Anderson, and he was so blown away that when he ran into Jamie at Bruford's wedding, right around that, I guess it's in 1973, he was so into what Jamie was doing on stage and what a great performer he was. He wanted to know everything about him and how he got into the stuff that he's into and what he's into. And he told John Anderson, "You want to read the Autobiography of Yogi," which, as many of our listeners will know, became the book that inspired John Anderson to come up with the 4-movement piece Tales from Topographic Oceans, which came out in 1973. So the timeline on that is very interesting because Jamie Muir getting John Anderson excited about percussion, and when you get to Tales from Topographic Oceans, 3rd and 4th movements, huge amounts of percussion.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting to me because Yes then really took it to another level where everybody in the band was playing percussion at one point, but a lot of percussion on the Ancient and a lot of percussion on Ritual. So Jamie really had an impact, but it led me to this situation where I was really interested in what else Jamie did. How when you're a kid and you find out oh, so and so is on that record. I wonder what else he's on. So I was following, trying to see what else there was of Jamie. And Jamie had come from the Music Improvisation Company. Well, what was the Music Improvisation Company? Music Improvisation Company had a record on ECM Records in 1970, which was in the import bin at my local record store, Sound City in Teaneck, New Jersey. And we would go in there, and the guy who worked there, Mike, who had a fake British accent, I never knew it was a fake British accent until I ran into another guy from the store, and he said, "Oh, by the way," no, I said to him, remember that guy Mike that used to work at Sound City? He was from Britain. He said, "Oh no, he wasn't from Britain. He just put on that accent to make people think he was from Britain so that he could get girls and stuff." And I thought, wow, that's really great. So so we had imports, and we had ECM, Music Improvisation Company, and lo and behold, it had Derek Bailey, Jamie Muir, Evan Parker, Hugh Davies, and Christine Jeffrey. And when we got that, and I was in high school, I couldn't make heads or tails of it. It was complete bonkers, like noise crowds to me. It was just like it was just clouds of junk and noise, and you couldn't tell who was Derek and who was you and who was Evan. I mean, you could sort of occasionally tell, but the point was they were trying to make something completely different.
Mm.
And they weren't going to play in any idiomatic fashion. And it was a group that had existed for a couple of years before that. So they got to ECM, and that's what they sounded like in 1970. 2 years later, Jamie gets called by Robert Fripp, and apparently a writer from Rolling Stone or someone had recommended Jamie for King Crimson. And they got together, and it really worked. Jamie added a lot to the visuals. He, I think, was definitely cut a lot of slack live, but I don't feel like he was captured as well on the album as he could have been. He's either edited or he's really given his marching orders in certain spots. But I think that it's also part of the charm of that record. Also, I like the idea that the record is different from the live performances, but the live performances are all from before the material was recorded.
Interesting.
So that's only so useful in terms of what that band would have been like if they went out on the road touring that material after it came out and did free improv. Just saying, it's something to think about.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But it's also fun to think about the fact that Fripp had already dipped into the free improv scene in London with Keith Tippett's on Lizard and Wake of Poseidon, right? And we heard Cecil Taylor style piano playing on Cat Food. So I mean that's all pretty interesting that Robert Fripp was into that kind of scene, and then ends up with another guy who's also had played with Derek Bailey besides Keith Tippett's, was Jamie Muir. So Jamie was he was an influence on me just to see that there was another way of approaching percussion in a rock band. I played percussion in a rock band that had a different drummer on a couple of occasions, and I was definitely influenced by Jamie, also influenced by Maurice Pert in that situation. Maurice Pert, another great Scottish guy. It's really interesting to think about that. Maurice Pert and Jamie Muir are both Scottish.
Mm.
And yeah, so then I graduated in 1981, graduated from Teaneck High School to go to college at Rutgers, continuing to study percussion and composition. But I was really already way into free improvisation because I had bands in high school that were doing it with friends. I had tried to come up with different ways of incorporating percussion into anything I was doing. So Gong was an influence, the band Gong.
Mm.
To have vibraphone in the band was always a thing, so that started pretty early. Um, but yeah, so in '81, when I was graduating, an album came out by Jamie Muir and Derek Bailey called Dart Drug. And I emphasize the T for a reason. We'll get to that in a minute. But Dart Drug was a duet record, but in a sense, it's kind of like a percussion solo record with guitar accompaniment. Because Derek's approach on the guitar on that record is very spare. And in a way, I feel like that's why he put out the album as Jamie Muir and Derek Bailey, not the other way around.
Mm.
So it's Derek at his most choosy, I guess. I mean, in a way, he's really very choice about his moments and his sound choices. He's playing electric with a volume pedal. But that record, Dart Drug, just took over, man. I mean, when I was starting to think about what I was going to do as a percussionist in a free context, in addition to being into Steve McCall and Andrew Sorrell and having studied with them to prepare sort of a concept of what free jazz drumming was, I also had Jamie in mind in terms of what a percussionist and a drummer were going to be able to do together. Even what a
that album, like,
percussionist was.
that album starts with like bowed vibraphone.
Right. So bowed glockenspiel or bells on Dart Drug to start, and then he's doing little glissandi strokes on it, and I ended up being seriously into bowing after that.
Mm.
You know, I have pieces as early as 83, 84 where I'm bowing. So he was an influence. There's glockenspiel right away, and as everybody knows, I'm a huge glockenspiel freak. So that was very early. Also, the just the unrecognizable quality of his sound choices. Like, what is that? Is that a screen door? Like, is that? And at some point, you're like, oh yeah, that's pot tops, very heavy metal pot tops. He had gun shell, like artillery shells, that spent artillery shells that functioned as different tuned cowbells. You know, and as I started to try to figure out my own percussion setup, that was a big question to me. Was like, Jamie has some, like, definitely bowing some things, and he's using found percussion. That's really interesting. So I was really getting into bottles and cans and you know, different found objects that could be tuned. Definitely water, you know, using water to tune glasses and things like that. So yeah, I mean, he definitely inspired me to do a bunch of stuff that I guess if I hadn't heard it in a rock context, I wouldn't have been so easy to go completely to the free improv avant-garde. But certainly that whole culture, that time period was everything's on the table, try it. You know, we didn't have to think so much about genre back then. Still don't. So that opened up this whole world of European improv, because then through listening to Jamie, I started listening to Derek and just fell in love with Derek's unpredictable playing and his sounds, and he seemed very percussive to me. It seemed like, see, I did what I did with him with wanting to play with Derek was the same thing I did with wanting to play with Cecil. I sat in my practice room and played along to their solo recordings.
Mm.
You can definitely get a lot of ideas of how you would interact with someone based upon their static solo recording that maybe you don't know perfectly, so you're not hearing it like you know what it is. I was hearing things that I wouldn't know. So there are plenty of Cecil and Derek solo records where you could put that on and play along to it. I suggest you do it today. So that was a great training ground for me, because when I noticed Derek Bailey was playing in New York, within a year of leaving high school, I went to see him play, and I saw him, but not with Jamie. It was with Jerry Hemingway on drums. Hugh Davies came out for that one, so I got to see Hugh Davies, the late great Hugh Davies. Actually, that's pretty cool. So, um, yeah, and then eventually Derek Bailey was playing in the East Village at a place called the Saint with John Zorn and George Lewis, trio that they had. And Derek, I didn't realize that, but he was living in New York at the time, and this would be the fall of '83. Um, I was in my second year, I think, at Rutgers. I was 20. And I went up to Derek after the concert. I said, I'm a really big fan of your music. I would love to play with you sometime. And he said, how's tomorrow? So we worked it out. I picked him up with my grandfather's '74 Impala and drove him out to New Jersey, and we started playing together. And from '83 to '88, Derek and I were playing together on and off. And eventually, he invited me to come to play a company event at the London Institute of Contemporary Arts, summer of 1988. And that was big because now Derek was asking me to come over and play in London with him. And I pretty much put two and two together and realized that that would give me an opportunity. And I immediately asked Derek, if I'm coming over to play with you for a week of shows, uh, do you think I could meet Jamie Muir? And he said, I'll give you his address. You can write to him. So I wrote to Jamie, real fanboy letter, but just a letter of appreciation. And he wrote back to me. I still have it somewhere. Uh, and and he said, "Yeah, man, cool. Call me when you get to town, and we'll get together." Basically, so it was really nice, beautiful handwriting. I mean, just total artist. And so I booked my flight, and I went over to play in Company Week. It was the biggest Company Week I think of all time that Derek had done before or since. It was 24 people from around the world. It was the most international, was the point of it. I think it was August of '88, and so it was. I was trying to remember earlier all the guys that were on. It was a lot of people. Um, I had it written down here somewhere. Okay, yeah, it was Peter Koval, the bassist from Germany, LaDonna Smith, the violist from Alabama, Luke Houkamp, the alto saxophonist, I think from Belgium or Holland, I'm sorry. Dennis Palmer, the late keyboard player from Tennessee. Lo Coxill was on this. It was just an incredible cast of people. And so, I mean, I was thrown in with the heavyweights, and Gavin Bryars was on that. Gavin Bryars played bass on that. So I got to play with Gavin Bryars in a totally improvised situation with Derek. Some of the groupings were really cool that week. If you don't know how companies set up, the way it's set up is over X number of nights. Derek figures how many players are on the thing, and they play in different groupings based upon choices that each person makes. So when it was my night to perform, I could choose who I wanted to play with.
So like
And,
two or four players, or how many players?
there were some bigger groups. I noticed that people were avoiding bigger groups. So there was a bigger group at the end, which nobody was into and nobody thought was going to work and didn't really work. Because that's the hardest part, because large group improvisation, oh, man, that's so hard. So let me tell you about finally getting together with Jamie Muir. I called him when I got to London, and he invited me over to see his place in Crane Grove, where Dart Drug was recorded with 2 stereo microphones. And Jamie was such a gentleman and just so sweet. And at the time he was painting. He's always been a painter. He's always been a visual artist. And at this point, he wasn't doing music. He was painting. large canvases, as I recall, abstract. And recollection of one painting was sort of almost a fluorescent color or a bright red colored mask on a charcoal background field that just really popped. And so he was there. He was covered in paint, and he was sort of in a darkened house. I think it was all about natural light for him, which was really interesting. And he told me about a lot of his experiences in music that he was, disappointed with. He did think being in Crimson was really cool, but I think that he also is a very unsettled sort. So when it became boring to him or had done whatever he wanted it to do, he was ready to move on. And he said as much, he wanted to become involved with Buddhism and really focus on that. And that's what I noticed. He's really a searching kind of soul searching guy, and really aspires to get himself together. And I totally enjoyed hanging out with him. He took me to the best Indian food I've ever had, which was in London, in the West End, and it was a great place. So I was at his place, and we're hanging out, and he's showing me paintings, and he's telling me, all he ever eats is cheese and bread or bananas, and so I'm kind of talking about Crimson, and in the middle of talking about Crimson, he says to me, "Do you want to see the gear?" And I said, "The gear from Lark's Tongues?" He goes, "Yeah, that and other stuff." So he takes me to his gear room, which is a spare bedroom that had multiple shelves on both sides of the room. And he had all the stuff in there. And he gave me a tour of the stuff. And at one point he showed me, one of the things that I found interesting about Jamie's setup, as much as you could determine what it was, is that he had things that seemed to be able to keep going either with one hand or just on their own. And he could, they'd be rotating through a bunch of bells or something. He had those built for him on when he was on Crimson. So guys who were working on the crew would build something he could spin, and it would sort of like go, repeatedly rhythmically against a disc, or I remember it was like a saw disc that was kind of being hit by a tine. And then the Thunder Sheet from Easy Money,
Yep.
Cup chimes, wood blocks, Almglocken, Swiss cowbells, just tons of stuff. Not a lot of drum stuff, which really makes sense because whatever that drum set was on Lark's Tongues, I don't think he had it anymore. But he had a lot of the other sounds. So I'm just speechless. I'm in this room. I'm like looking at all this stuff and touching it and just saying this is the stuff. And he says to me, "Take anything you want for the gig with Derek this week. Just bring it back." So that was a moment, and so I did. I remember grabbing the Almglocken. I definitely wanted that Thunder Sheet to be there. I think there were some rototoms because I love rototoms, so I grabbed rototoms, wood blocks, and I had all my own mallets and things like that. And Derek had specified that I play vibraphone as well as whatever else I play. So he said he would rent a vibraphone for me, which I have to say to this day is just an incredible nod to how few vibraphonists there are in improvising music and tuned percussionists in general in that area. And that that was one of the reasons I wanted to do that, played vibes with Derek, play vibes with Cecil, is because there wasn't a lot of tuned percussion stuff in that music, and I always thought there was a great place for it. So Derek wanted me to play vibraphone, and so I had my vibraphone and I had my full percussion set up. And on the third night, it was my night to choose who I wanted to play with. So I knew that was going to be my night, and I called Jamie and I invited Jamie and I put him on the guest list. And I got to sound check, getting set up, and then they let the audience in. As I'm going out to the bar, Jamie is coming in. And so I see him, I greet him, just make sure you got in okay. And Gray says, okay, I'm looking forward. Let me find a good seat. He goes to sit down. And as he's walking in to the venue, people start recognizing him.
Hmm.
And that was interesting to me because I thought they better recognize him. If anybody's going to recognize him, these folks should recognize this man. And they did. And people were coming over to shake his hand. And then one guy came over to him because I was watching this. I stopped going to where I was going to go, I think outside. And a guy says to him, so Jamie, you're here to check out Derek? And he said, no, I'm here to listen to Gregg Bendian and, of course, Derek. And I got to hear him say that. And, that was huge.
It's cool.
That was huge. And so I was playing his gear from Dark Drug and Lark's Tongues on stuff with Derek Bailey. And I had been playing with Derek since '83, which is 2 years after Dark Drug. And I was just thinking about this today. And, you don't put all these things together until you really have a chance to reflect.
Mm-hmm.
But it all happened so fast because Dark Drug came out, and then 2 years into college, I was playing with Derek. And then 5 years after that, I was playing with Derek in England, and Jamie Muir came out to hear what I was doing, playing the percussion from those previous recordings and in a completely different way. The British Library has the tapes from these recordings, from these events. So they are apparently available. The guy who recorded this stuff, who recorded so much incredible live music, important archivist, also an important developer of surround sound, the British man Michael Gerzon, Gerzon. And Michael was in the front row every night with his mic set up, recording everything. And when Michael passed, all of his archive went to the British Library. So that stuff is actually available. I hope that it's easily available, but we'll see. I actually just recently started trying to track it down. I have tapes that Michael Gerzon gave me. And so I do have, I was asked to play that night, that third night, and I decided the first thing I wanted to do was a solo vibraphone piece, since Derek really wanted something different. And I had just started experimenting with clamps on the keys to make them dead and not possible to put the pedal down and ring on the vibraphone. So I had this setup of choosing certain intervals within the keyboard to turn into dead notes. And I did that as my first piece, sort of as also a tribute to the guys that were doing prepared instrument stuff, Hans Reichel and Fred Frith. And, but a lot of times percussionists weren't really the inspiration for some of the ideas that I had. A lot of times it was non-percussionists. And so I played that piece, and Michael gave me a tape of that piece. And I also did a trio with Kovald and Derek, which I played vibraphone on. So I was trying to not just play percussion, but to play the vibraphone as much as possible. And at the end of the week, I went to see Jamie again and bring the gear back to him. And I realized when I was unloading everything from the cab that I threw everything into, that a wood block that I had used ended up in a different case that was back at the hotel. And that's the wood block that I was talking about at the opening. And I felt really bad. I said, Jamie, I left that wood block in my bag. And he looked at me and he said, oh, okay. So why don't you hold on to it? And, I said, really? Because I'll mail it back to you. It's not an issue, or I can just leave it at the hotel. He said, no, I want you to have it.
Hmm.
And so I've had it ever since, and I treasure it. I actually have used it on a bunch of recordings. But Jamie's influence on my playing has always been there. Um, the idea of using chains and bows, they both end up on the Cecil Taylor record I did,
Yeah.
Florescence. The first track, J, has chains on it, and then my solo piece, chains and bowed metal. In fact, talking about junk, I bowed a metal exit sign at the end of Entity, that solo piece. So, yeah, and the fact that Derek was cool, Cecil was cool with that. Cecil was completely cool with a much more of a hybrid European American approach, which is what I tried to do. But Jamie had seeped into Cecil's music in that way, just the idea of liquefying the sounds without having to roll. Sustained sounds could be used with chains, sustained sounds could happen with bows. Jamie's use of long sounds was always something that I liked, continuous sounds. Like I say, the idea of rotoring over a piece of metal to get this continuous sound going. That's where I got into rub tones. I said, what are the ways that we can have long sounds without having to roll? We're so limited in that way as percussionists, right? So that's when I got the little Suzuki bows that little kids use rather than trying to use a violin bow because you can't get around the instrument. So Jamie was a big influence on me in that way. And when I ended up recording the prepared vibraphone piece, it's called Resultant. I dedicated it to Derek, and it's on my Definite Pitch album, which is on Spotify. And then the solo, the trio percussion piece, Flazier, which is a fully notated piece, not an improvisational piece, which the New Jersey Percussion Ensemble played for that recording. That's dedicated to Jamie Muir. So right in my first solo album, I wanted to name check some of the guys that were super important to me. And, Jamie's been important to me, as I say, for a very long time, since high school. And then there, another reference that I made to him in my music that I had a lot of fun with was when Richard Leo Johnson and I did the record Who Knew Charlie Shoe. I wanted to be a character the way he was being a character. He was being Charlie Shoe, so I created this character called Junkfish. And Junkfish was such a reference to Jamie Muir in terms of he came from a progressive rock band and a jazz background, but Junkfish eventually kind of just loses all interest in that, becomes burned out on it, and he becomes a floor junk percussionist. He works in a junkyard and he plays junk instruments. And that's what I wanted to do for this acoustic guitar record with Richard. And on the liner notes, it said, at one point it says, Junkfish says, "What's up?" to Jamie Muir. And like little things like that, I just like referencing someone who's so important to me, yet I don't think enough people really know what he was about and what he offered us in terms of options for sounds, incorporating this whole notion of sound and music is everywhere. Jamie, by the way, still going strong. He, from what I hear, is living in Cornwall, beautiful part of the UK, and I wish him all the best because he is really just such a fascinating musician and artist. And if you're not familiar with his stuff, really check it out if you can. Anything from the Lark Tongues era, anything with Derek Bailey. He also made a recording with Michael Giles of King Crimson and a third percussionist, name is escaping me, called Ghost Dance. But largely, apart from a few company records where he doesn't play on a lot of the tracks, I have to say, I go with Dart Drug, and I go with Music Improvisation Company and with Lark's Tongues. And when I made my duo record with Derek called Banter, I had to also reference Jamie. And so the last track is a track where I played only bowed cymbals, always a bowed vibraphone and glockenspiel. And Derek was doing feedback. And I named it Crane Grove and Dark because I wanted to reference the misprint on some of the first copies that I saw of Dart Drug, where it was mislabeled Dark Drug, and there was a controversy. Is it dark or dart? But what it was a reference to standing on Crane Grove, Jamie's Street, outside in the after hang of hang. It's like it's one of those hangs where we had just really hooked up and we're just going and talking about life and talking about music and talking about everything. And we're standing outside of his house, and it's dark. And I just was looking around, and there was a beautiful street lamp not too far away, and it was sort of shining on us. And I was thinking, this is such a great moment. I'm hanging out here with one of my heroes, and he's super cool, and he's going to loan me some gear. That's how much he trusts me. And so I wanted to memorialize that. So the closing piece on Banter is dedicated to Jamie Muir, and it's called Crane Grove and Dark. And Banter has been remastered, and you can hear some of it all of it on YouTube if you look up Banter, Derek Bailey, Gregg Bendian. So that's kind of my story. It's a very fond memory and something that I still think about. I'm really excited, and always the door is open if Jamie ever wants to get in touch. I'd love to hear from him. If anybody out there, progressive music fans or otherwise, know about it, how to get in touch with him, I'd love to know. Love to have him on this program to chat about music and painting and art, you know. So that's the story of Gregg Bendian and Jamie Muir and Gregg Bendian. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Matt, for being there, for moral support on this new endeavor on the ProgCast. We'll do more of these. I certainly have a lot of crazy stories to share, like the time I went to see the Grateful Dead at Madison Square Garden with Cecil Taylor and Ornette Coleman. We'll talk about that a different time. Anyway, please like and subscribe. Been a pleasure. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody. See you next time. Jamie, this is for you. Thank you, Jamie.